policy proposal is making its way through the Democratic presidential field. At a town hall in Mississippi Monday night, presidential hopeful and Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren proposed ending the Electoral College.
Presidential candidates don't come to places like Mississippi. Yeah, they also don't come to places like California and Massachusetts, right? Because we're not the battleground states. We can have national voting, and that means get rid of the Electoral College and everybody.
That proposal was championed by President Trump before he won the 2016 election, which Mr. Trump won because of the Electoral College. Let's bring in CBS News political correspondent Ed O'Keefe. So, Ed, why is Elizabeth Warren choosing to bring up this proposal now? And do you expect to see more Democrats support it?
Well, she brought it up during an event in Mississippi, a state where Democrats mostly draw support from black voters. And there have been concerns in that state, across many other southern states, and among Democratic voters across the country about ballot access issues, voting rights, and concerns that people's votes aren't either being properly counted or really are counting towards anything consequential at all. And so she was essentially asked about voting rights and then went so far as to say that she thinks it should be abolished. And it drew notable response, in part because Warren, so far, next to Bernie Sanders, has been seen as perhaps the most serious when it comes to introducing policy ideas in all sorts of realms. And so for her to go that far was seen by many as quite a notable move, and a sign that she understands the concerns of a lot of liberal Democrats who believe that the Electoral College should be banned, in part because they just don't comprehend why it is that a system that requires a certain number of electoral votes doesn't necessarily coincide with the candidate that wins the popular vote.
Well, President Trump won the 2016 election because of the Electoral College. How can Democrats get past claims that they are being, quote unquote, sore losers? Well,
that's going to be an interesting part of this, Elaine, if it becomes a bigger deal. And there are other candidates, to your earlier question, that do support this. Pete Buttigieg has talked about it. Some of the other Democrats have been asked and generally feel that, it's something that maybe needs to be explored. Some are fans of this project that some states have now put in place where they would award their electoral votes to whoever wins the nationwide popular vote, not their statewide popular vote. But those laws won't take effect until states representing at least 270 electoral votes actually enact similar laws. And so far there's about 12 states in the District of Columbia that have done so. The argument they're going to have to continue making, the one they think they should make, is that, look, there should be a principle of one person, one vote. That counts as much no matter where they are. But the argument that some Republicans turn around and make, and they were making it today, is that this will essentially incentivize campaigning in large cities and the bigger states, and mean that flyover states, as some Republicans called them today, will essentially get ignored. As Lindsey Graham of South Carolina tweeted earlier today, the desire to abolish the Electoral College is driven by the idea Democrats want rural America to go away politically. The irony is that Warren made this argument in Mississippi, right, what has been a red state and is a rural state, and one that Democrats don't do well in, at least at the presidential level. And the argument she was making is, I should have to come here and to every other state to get your vote because that system works better than focusing on just, a dozen states that are the swing ones that could essentially swing their electoral votes to either candidate. And the argument being that I should have to campaign in California and Massachusetts and Mississippi and all these other places. And given that some states have moved up their primaries in 2020, you will see attention paid to states that haven't necessarily had the attention of presidential candidates in the past, but that's only necessarily during the primary calendar, not necessarily during the general election.
And switching gears, I spoke with the Trump campaign director of strategic communications, Mark Lauder, earlier. He said the president will focus his campaign on an economic message. Do Democrats have a plan to counter that message if the economy is still strong in 2020?
They'll continue to point out if the economy is still strong and wage gaps exist between men and women, between white, black, and Latino workers, they'll continue to stress that those gaps have to be closed. They will continue to raise concerns about the tax plan that Democrats would say favors the wealthiest in this country and leads to working class or lower income Americans not necessarily getting their fair shake in that regard, at least in their view. And they will focus on a continued push to see the minimum wage increased in all 50 states, if not to $15 as some would propose, then to make sure at least that it is climbing over the course of several years. So Democrats are happy to have economic debates with the president. Sure, low unemployment, strong GDP growth would benefit the incumbent. They always do. But Democrats will say, look underneath those numbers and really ask yourselves, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And are your children being set up to be more successful than you were? That has always, of course, been a long-sought American ideal, that the next generation will do better. If you look at some polling these days, it suggests that isn't necessarily the case.
Well, former Texas Congressman Beto O'Rourke is facing some criticism over how he's handled questions about his policy positions. What more are you hearing about that?
We're hearing actual voters now call him out for it, which is indicative of the frustration that some are already seeing. He's been now in the last week to Iowa, to Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and he concludes his day tonight in Keene, New Hampshire, at the head of a 2-day, 10-county, all-county tour of the Granite State. And that is a state especially where voters expect to hear you speak specifically and openly about these kinds of, about policy, about your policy ideas and why you think certain things should or should not happen. He got called out by one woman who said, when are we going to hear you get off the platitudes and focus on actual specific information? And he said, well, look, I've introduced some ideas on criminal justice reform. I want to listen to all of you and help craft my ideas that way. But that isn't necessarily what people show up to hear, especially in Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, the states that are the most discerning and get to see all of these candidates. They expect to hear a little more specific. Sure, they want to feel good about the person. They want to get a sense that that person could fill the job, but they also want to know what they're for. And that's also consistent with what Democrats were looking for and understood they needed to do last year in order to win all those congressional seats. Sure, be against the president, but what specifically are you for? What would you do if Democrats retook control of Congress? It looks like they're going to be expecting that of their presidential candidates as well, and if O'Rourke doesn't have specific answers, he could suffer for that.
Well, a new Emerson College poll shows the president trailing or tied with a number of Democrats in Wisconsin. How much of a barometer is that state providing for what might be to come in the 2020 election?
Well, if you believe these numbers, and you shouldn't necessarily, at least take them with a big block of sea salt, it suggests that the president's underwater in a state that he won barely in 2016. This likely feeds the belief among some Democrats that it wasn't about the Democratic Party so much as it was about Hillary Clinton specifically in 2016 in places like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And we've seen the Democratic Party win legislative seats, local seats, gubernatorial races in those Midwestern states where the president had done well. So his team knows, he knows, that he could face an uphill slog in those places that he narrowly and unexpectedly won in 2016, and that he'll have to work hard if he wants to win them back. Remember, Wisconsin, while is home to Reince Priebus and Paul Ryan and Scott Walker and Ron Johnson, and has been seen as a Republican success story in recent years, it has now flipped back, at least at state leadership, to almost entirely Democrats. And so they're now in a better position ahead of the 2020 elections to be organizing the state and turning out voters. And this early poll at least suggests that they're in good shape. And remember, the 2020 Democratic Convention is going to be held in Milwaukee, so potentially the party will enjoy an even bigger advantage because of that.
All right, we'll continue to watch it. Ed O'Keefe, thanks so much, Ed.
Take care, Elaine.